don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I spoke with Natalie Wexler, who returns to the podcast after several previous episodes. Natalie is an education writer and the author of The Knowledge Gap, co-author of The Writing Revolution, and most recently, Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning. She also maintains a Substack publication called Minding the Gap. Before I get to the details of our conversation, as this is the first episode of 2026, I want to welcome you to the new year and note that this is our 10-year anniversary of providing professional development and learning for schools around the world. We started in January of 2016 and have grown and learned a whole heck of a lot in this decade, and we're looking forward to a really great year. If you or someone you know is interested in professional learning that is grounded in evidence and seeks to empower teachers to prepare learners for the modern world, I encourage you to visit us at wegrowteachers.com. There you'll find all of our work, which is focused through the lens of knowledge-rich inquiry. Early bird registration is open for our summer conference, PBL Grow 26, and we have some wonderful new online course options for differentiation and PBL, along with our new AI PBL design tool that you can find under the online courses menu item. Of course, our blog posts and these podcasts are all there as well, and we're booking spring and summer PD for schools, so if you're looking to grow your school, that's wegrowteachers.com. In this conversation with Natalie, we talked about two of her recent blog pieces that caught my eye. The first is on the importance of elaboration in the learning process, as she argues that while explicit instruction and retrieval practice are important, an over-reliance on them risks reducing learning to something like the regurgitation that some critics cite as a problem. The second piece is about the efficacy of research and the ease and the problems of citing research that may not be of the highest quality. That segued us into talking more about reading instruction, her latest book, Beyond the Science of Reading, and differing approaches to schooling and instruction. It's always a pleasure to talk with Natalie, and this conversation was no different. I hope you'll check out her work. One note, as of this recording, I've been a bit under the weather, so you may hear some congestion in my voice, and apologies if my thought process was a bit more wandering than usual in this conversation. I'm on the way to full recovery, but the medicine did have me in a bit of a fog, so much so that I forgot to press record on the video, so this one is audio only. Sorry for those of you who prefer video, but I do hope you enjoy the conversation regardless. And now here's that conversation with Natalie Wexler. I am with Natalie Wexler, who is has graciously returned to the podcast. It's been a number of years. I know, Natalie, I think you've been on at least a couple times, I think it's solo, and then you were part of a panel discussion that we did with Emily Hanford and I believe Kate Wynn, who's a teacher, or at least was a teacher up in Canada, and then Mickey Ray, who is with the Kentucky Department of Education. And we talked about the reading wars, but much water has passed under the bridge since then, so we're going to maybe revisit some of those things, including a couple blog pieces that you've written recently that I thought were interesting. But before we get to all that, I want to give you an opportunity to reintroduce yourself to anybody who's listening who is not familiar with you, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Sure, great. Well, so I'm Natalie Wexler, and I'm an education writer. I'm the author of a book called The Knowledge Gap, and the co-author of a book called The Writing Revolution with Judith Hochman. And then most recently, I've written a book, came out last year, called Beyond the Science of Reading, Connecting Literacy Instruction to the Science of Learning. And I have a Substack called Minding the Gap.
Right. And on the Minding the Gap, you have a recent blog piece that was, I thought, again, really interesting to me because it hits some of the pieces, at least, that I tend to talk about, the importance of explicit instruction, the cognitive science and science of learning, writ large, trademark. There is, I think, no doubt that, progressive education, however you want to characterize it, has done maybe a poor job of including and having conversation about the importance of knowledge and about the importance of teaching. We see it sometimes in our project-based learning workshops where teachers will say, wait a minute, am I actually supposed to teach? We, of course, want to disabuse them of that. But there's also, I think, a real important issue of those folks who are advocating for something that's more like explicit instruction to not leave out the sort of what happens when you get students to remember things. And that elaboration piece, I think, that you're talking about in this piece, which is was published on your Substack on January 4th, talks about the importance of that. So maybe if you want to unpack that a little bit, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, I think this was spurred partly by my reading of people who were writing about cognitive science, interpreting that for educators, and partly by a trip we were talking about before we started recording that I made to Australia, which is a place that I think Australia and England have both embraced, that the teacher workforce is more familiar with cognitive sciences principles like retrieval practice. There's more classroom implementation of those principles than I personally, at least, have seen in this country. There may be some schools that have embraced explicit instruction and retrieval practice in the ways that I've seen it embraced in Australia in particular, but I haven't seen them. And what I've noticed in both the discussion and some of the classroom practice I saw was, yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on explaining things clearly, checking for understanding, having kids then retrieve the information from long-term memory and repeat it back. And all of that is important, but what I wasn't seeing was there is also scientific evidence on something called elaboration. And what elaboration means is just really having students contribute something from, either from long-term memory, from their personal experience, analysis, connecting different texts together, sort of, those sort of higher order things that we've heard a lot about without the necessary foundation of having the information stored in long-term memory to draw on. But it seemed to me that it was really important to ensure that students are given the opportunity to elaborate for a couple of reasons. And one, sort of strategically, some of what I saw in those classrooms in Australia was the kind of thing that people who are critics of explicit instruction would criticize as, they're just regurgitating facts. And I mean, I didn't spend a huge amount of time in those classrooms. Maybe at some point they would ask them some questions that required more than that, but I didn't see that. And so I think if we don't also give students the opportunity to sort of think about things and contribute some analysis that we are playing into the hands, we being, people who are advocating for the science of learning, for cognitive science, we're sort of giving ammunition to those critics to say, well, this is just about having, pouring facts into kids' brains and having them spit them back out. And that's not what learning is about. But the other more fundamental reason is, they're right. That is not all that learning is about. And I think if we don't give students at really all levels, grade levels, all sort of levels of ability, if we don't give them the opportunity to do some elaboration in a cognitively manageable way on what they've learned, that we are depriving them of the opportunity to really develop to their full potential academically and cognitively.
Yeah, it is, again, really resonant with a lot of what I've been trying to communicate and say. And I think explicit instruction is important. I think the lessons that we learn from cognitive science are important. Although in our tribal world, I'm most likely put on this sort of inquiry side, right? The progressive side, the whatever one might put and one might label what is on the opposite side from the quote unquote science of learning, again, however you want to label that, which I find to be troubling because I think it's yes and not either or. And one of my assertions has been kind of that first thing that you mentioned, which is you run the risk if you don't, as educators, advocate for and sort of insist on the full range of the ways in which students might engage with content and knowledge and thinking, um, and really just sort of focus on the things that you mentioned seeing in that classroom, which, again, to be fair, you could have walked out and 20 minutes later seen something that was rich and deep and wonderful in all the ways that you didn't see. But you run the risk of doing just that and not the other. And again, it's not either or, it's yes and. But in the sort of tribal world that we are in, it's so hard to get that message across, because it's almost always received, it seems to me, as the enemy is criticizing us or attacking us, that kind of thing. So I'm curious what kind of response you have received from your blog piece.
Well, basically pretty positive. Was a little concerned that people might say, that I was endangering the cognitive science movement by calling for this kind of corrective. But
Right.
I haven't seen that. People, at least the ones that I've heard from have basically said, really glad you brought this up. It's some of them said, this is something that I've seen or I've been concerned about. And these are, I don't know who they all are, but they seem to be people who do have at least one foot in the sort of world of cognitive science. And as I said, elaboration there is research behind that. It's not like this is coming from outside of cognitive science.
Right.
It's just one part of the evidence that just hasn't gotten as much emphasis as other parts. And I would say, by the way, there's some evidence that elaboration accomplishes the same objective as retrieval practice. I mean, you've got to have some information in long-term memory in order to be able to elaborate about a topic. You can't elaborate on something that you don't know anything about. But when you start elaborating, you deepen that understanding, and you also improve your retention of that information. And in fact, there was one study I wrote about in the piece that I thought was really interesting, that had students divided into several groups. And so one group was engaging in elaboration. And in this instance, that meant, I think, coming up with their own examples about the content of a lecture that they had listened, they had, I guess, watched a video of. So one group was elaborating while not being able to review the video. They just had to remember what was in the video. The other group was able to access the video, consult the video while they were coming up with examples. And there was no difference in their retention. So the group that was allowed to access the video, they were not technically engaging in retrieval practice, because retrieval practice by definition means you're retrieving from long-term memory. You're not actually consulting a text or a video. And that can be difficult, because retrieval practice only works actually if you're successful at it. You have to be able to retrieve the information. So in terms of classroom application, I mean, especially if you've got kids who are not, experts, or that they're younger, they're not hugely proficient readers, whatever, it might be more effective to allow them to elaborate on a text or whatever while they are looking at it, than to have them try to remember it and elaborate on it, or just even to have them try to recall it. If you as a teacher feel like, well, I don't think my kids are actually going to remember everything that was in that text, or even the important points that were in that text, it could be a more successful activity to say, okay, you can look at this thing we just read, and now I want you to come up with examples of your own based on it. So you have to generate. It's not just coming up with examples from the text or the video. It's generating those examples of whatever the text or video is talking about. Kids are more likely to be successful when they don't have to rely on their memory as at the same time they're trying to elaborate. So anyway, I'm just saying there is evidence for elaboration. And I think it's not just tribalism. I mean, I think there is that, well, I'm a member of this camp and not that camp. That's part of it. But I also just think there's been, a reaction against years and years of discounting. I mean, the education orthodoxy has said it's not important to have kids retain factual information. We could just skip to having them develop critical thinking or whatever, and they can always Google that factual information. So I think that's part of why there's been so much emphasis on explicit instruction and retrieval practice, these things that are designed to just get information into long-term memory and enable people to retrieve it when they need it, because we just haven't been enabling kids to do that in the past.
Yeah, the idea of retrieval practice and when I think about that, I think you sort of characterized it maybe a little differently than and you're probably more accurate in terms of retrieval practice being remembering things and just recalling things. To me, a really good inquiry, or let's say thinking routines, like Harvard Project Zero's thinking routines, where you're making meaning of things and connecting things, which is, I said, a form of elaboration. To me, that's a form of retrieval practice. And you sort of made the comparison, but said maybe they're a little bit different, apples and oranges and semantics. But to me, the thing that is we want to have kids do is to do more thinking, right? If memory is the residue of thinking or thought, then the more thinking we have students do, and in my estimation, the more ways in which we have them think, and I think that's an important distinction, then the more likely they are to have different connections, neural connections, and ways in which they can retrieve retrieval cues. And so to me, that is a form of retrieval practice. And that's why I think I said on social media, maybe even today, not all retrieval practice is the same or the equal. I do think that there's different ways you can do, and I would say elaboration being one of them, that would provide more success in at least some ways of remembering things. There's certain things I think you broke memorization probably, or mnemonic devices and things like that probably more quickly and efficiently. I I wonder though, and maybe it's not tribalism, and maybe it kind of gets to your point. Um, is it to me? It's efficiency, and efficiency is so prized and prioritized in cognitive science and science of learning. Maybe not as much in science of reading. Um, you tell me. But to me, that matter of efficiency seems to be such a high priority, and perhaps one of the reasons why something like elaboration, which is a little messier, a little slower, not as easily quantifiable, not as easily measurable, and once we start getting into that territory, the cognitive science folks tend to start to go, well, what are we doing here, right? Does
Mhm.
that resonate?
Yeah, I think that does resonate to some extent. I mean, there are studies showing the benefits of elaboration, but there aren't nearly as many of them as there are showing the benefits of retrieval practice. And you could say, well, that must mean retrieval practice is better, but I think
Right,
what it means is retrieval practice is easier to study because
right.
it's pretty cut and dried. Elaboration could take lots of different forms, um, and it's might be hard to compare different students. I think, for example, the form of elaboration that I think is perhaps most powerful for various reasons is writing. Having students write even at the sentence level, if you have well constructed activities, is requiring them to elaborate, maybe give an example or explain come up with the rest of the sentence after the conjunction but or although, and that requires thinking about, well, what goes in the opposite direction, all that. But of course, writing is notoriously hard to evaluate objectively, and
Hmm.
so we don't have as many studies of writing, certainly not as many as we have of reading, and it's easiest to study decoding outcomes or math outcomes. And a lot of the cognitive science research has been done on math and to some extent science, but maybe because the researchers are coming from those backgrounds. But I also think it's easier to study that than to study, literature or history, or it's just a much more closed universe of concepts. So I do think that the research can mislead us because what is easier to study is often what does get studied. And this is true with reading comprehension too, by the way. It's easier to study what happens if you teach kids a reading comprehension strategy, like finding the main idea of a text. You do that for maybe 6 weeks, a couple hours a week, and then you give them a standardized reading comprehension test. And you do see, there are lots of studies finding positive results, but it doesn't mean it's more effective than building kids' knowledge to improve their reading comprehension. It takes maybe 3 years or more to see the results of building knowledge if you're using a standardized reading test to measure progress, because there's usually no connection between the knowledge that you've taught them and the knowledge that is assumed on the test. But with those reading comprehension strategies, I mean, you get very quick results. Yes, a few hours is as effective as a few hundred hours of instruction. And we spend way too much time on it given that bit of data. But the other thing is, we don't really know how long those benefits last of reading comprehension instruction, because usually kids aren't tested, a year later or whatever. And maybe when you teach them something like you have to think about the main idea, they'll remember that for a while, and they get that idea pretty quickly. But then maybe they forget it. It doesn't really help them in the long run.
Yeah. Well, that measurable piece, and I think that's a problem with inquiry as well, is that, at least in the way that I think about it, it's likely to be something that accumulates and sort of crystallizes over time with other things and more knowledge and more wisdom and more experience. And so because we can't see that evidence and those results as quickly, I think it's a harder sell to folks who are in that sort of math science realm. And I'm glad you brought that up, because that's something that I've mentioned and noticed myself as well. It seems like so many of the people who are really strong advocates of cognitive science and explicit instruction are almost always talking about math and science as well, but math is really, really, central. And as you mentioned, that is a difference from me as a social studies teacher or a psychology teacher or an ELA teacher, where we're talking about big open-ended questions which may not have a right answer, a quote unquote right answer, whereas 2 + 2 is supposed to equal 4. And so that to me seems like a real fundamental divide, and maybe is a good segue to get into the other blog piece that I wanted to touch on here, was the piece that you more recently had published, which is talking about some of the research that you had cited and seen, and it may be a bit of a mea culpa, or however you want to describe it, but not all research is the same, and we should be real careful with that.
Yeah, and it's hard for teachers. For me, I'm not a trained statistician or researcher, and I try to, I sort of know what the hallmarks are of good research, but it can be difficult to, as a layperson, really evaluate whether a certain study holds water or not. And so there were a couple of studies I'd written about over the years that at the time, I thought, well, this is surprising maybe, but I didn't say there's something wrong with the research. And one of them was more than one study, but there was one significant large-scale study that appeared to show that just turning on the captions for children when they're watching TV or video could dramatically improve their reading outcomes. Turns out that was, the evidence was pretty weak, and some researchers did a more rigorous study and found if you can't decode words fairly fluently, kids don't even look at the subtitles. It takes them too long to decode the words, so they just and even once they get, maybe to a second or third grade level, typical level of decoding the words, and this is what I had said when I wrote up. I don't think it's going to, if you can't decode, just reading captions is probably not going to be enough to teach you how to read, but it could help with fluency. And they found it didn't help any more with fluency than typical classroom instruction. So, I don't think I went way out on a limb with how I wrote about it, but I wanted to just correct that record. And the other study, which I was not the only one to write about, concluded that there was like 7,000 participants from elementary school age through college age. And this was instruction being delivered through a computer with a lot of, sort of according to cognitive science principles. So things like explicit instruction, retrieval practice delivered by the computer. And they found that, as they said, no matter that students did start in different places because of differences in background knowledge, essentially, but that it took the same number of learning opportunities, I think 7, for them to master any particular knowledge item. And this is all, it was things like math, learning a foreign language. So these were, basically memorization of discrete items of information. Now, that sort of is counterintuitive, but there are findings out there that are counterintuitive. And so I wrote this, I said, I don't really know if this is valid, but it does suggest that if we could equalize background knowledge, that our methods of instruction could do a lot to level the playing field. So this was a researcher I came across recently had written, he wasn't a researcher, actually, he was a math educator, had looked at this study saying all learners learn at essentially the same rate, and pointed up what he identified as some problems with the study. And I have to say, it was very mathematical, his explanation, and I'm not a math person. So I didn't follow every nuance, but basically he was saying that the researchers kind of discounted that there was an initial period of instruction before students got practice, and some students learned a lot faster during that initial period of instruction than others. So it wasn't that everybody was really learning at the same rate. And, that kind of makes sense because we know that people, for example, differ in their working memory capacity. And if you have a larger working memory capacity, you're liable to pick things up more quickly than someone else who might be able to master the same concept, but it's likely to take longer. So I did want to correct the record about that as well. I think, it's important if I put something out there and somebody comes along and qualifies it, I feel like it's incumbent upon me to put the qualifiers out there as well.
Yeah, and I think the mathematician, or I don't know what exact title would be best to describe him, but I think it's Justin, I don't know if it's Syak or exactly how you pronounce
Yeah.
his last name. And yeah, he can be very, very technical and very yeah, very forthright in some opinions as well about math. And he's one that I think is a good example of really being a math mind and citing evidence. It brings up, and I appreciate the humility, because I think that's a really important piece, as you mentioned. Like if you cite research, or if you're making assertions and then you change your mind, which is really what we want, education folks and researchers, or essentially all of us to do. And I'd make a pitch why I think again, inquiry is important, because it is fundamentally about am I right, being skeptical and changing your mind. But that humility, I lean into, or I try to lean away from it, but I can't seem to figure out a way to lean away from it, from that tribalism, and the ways in which people on either end of that sort of tribal spectrum will use research and evidence as sort of weapons in that discussion, and be less critical or less humble about things. Project Follow Through, I think, is a good example, which is a very interesting, and we should all be aware of those findings. But I see people regularly citing Project Follow Through as though it is the the holy grail of, well, direct instruction is what we should all be doing. And there's some real critiques to be made of it. And, I've seen some of those. Doesn't mean that direct instruction isn't important, but let's be honest about the research and the limitations of research. So, I'm curious, how do you think about the sort of matter of precision in the what the evidence tells us, right? Whether it's reading and phonics this, phonics that, comprehension this. How should teachers and educational researchers, in your view, think about that I guess the issue of precision and the takeaways that we get from evidence and research that we find?
Well, I think it really, it depends on what you're teaching, to some extent. I think, if you're teaching something straightforward like decoding words or multiplication and division, I think there's a lot of research that could be very helpful to guide instruction. When you get to more conceptual things and social studies, literature, I think it only takes you so far. I don't think research, I've seen questions. There's another Substacker who said, but, how do I know which novels to teach? And how do I know when to focus on imagery and when to just read for the plot? And I don't think research is going to answer all of those questions. I think, when you're a teacher, you're always going to have to rely to some extent on your sense of your particular students, the difficulty of whatever it is that you're trying to teach, to know how fast to go, how slow to go, what kind of reading to assign, what is realistic. I don't think, we can wait for research to tell us to answer all of those questions. And I think even if we waited a good long time, I'm not sure research ever could answer all those questions. So I think, we have to not just ignore research, but we do need to recognize its limitations, that it can only get us so far. And a lot of, I think that sometimes we become afraid to rely on our common sense, because things have gotten so tangled up in, well, is there evidence for that? Or there's evidence for some things, yeah, but there are some things that, you have to sort of extrapolate on your own from whatever evidence is available, but you're not going to get the precise answer to every question from research.
Yeah, it's hard for me on social media when I see people, and again, I see it on both ends of the spectrum, making really bold assertions with absolute certainty. Someone might call it the certainty trap, and I think that's fundamentally dangerous, because you can always find exceptions. You can always find ways. I think it's Dylan William that said something like, everything works somewhere and everything.
And nothing works everywhere.
Nothing works everywhere. Yeah, I'm butchering it, but that's right, right? I mean, it is contextual. There is no algorithm. It's more of a heuristic, and being thoughtful and considerate and saying, well, what does this research say, and what might it be telling us? How does that factor into where I am with my students and my skill and my ability? People ask me, should you be doing inquiry, high levels of inquiry with limited guidance? No, you shouldn't, unless your students are really, really far along in being able to do that kind of thing. And there are students that can do that kind of thing, but most students are not. So being able to perceive where your students are and get that thinking out, so that then you can be accurate in your response, I think is a fundamental piece of it. So where are we with reading? And I mean, we've got the Mississippi Miracle. We've got all these amazing things happening. You wrote a book, like you said, Beyond the Science of Reading, last year. Where are we?
Well, I think it's definitely some good things have happened with reading, but I think the focus in the media, for the most part, and sort of a lot of the discussion, is on the so-called Mississippi Miracle, and basically saying, well, we need to teach phonics, we need to teach it explicitly and systematically, and that's all we need to do. And that is far from all we need to do. Yeah, we do need to do that. I certainly not against systematic phonics instruction, but Mississippi is getting a lot of attention, and it deserves attention, but there are other states that have gone sort of further, good decoding instruction will get you improved fourth grade NAEP scores? Yes. Will it get you improved eighth grade NAEP scores? Probably not, because when you get to higher grade levels, what determines whether or not you're a proficient reader, beyond just your ability to decode the words, is your whether you know the vocabulary, whether you have background knowledge, familiarity with complex syntax. And every year that goes by, the assumptions about the complexity of your knowledge increase. If you don't have, and this is why, kids hit a wall when they get to higher grade levels often. And it also has to do with decoding more, multisyllabic words and things like that. So one reason I wrote this book was I saw the science of reading just being basically defined as phonics. And there's a lot of science related to reading beyond phonics, particularly to reading comprehension. And that scientific evidence is really part of this larger body of evidence, cognitive science, science of learning. As we were saying, the cognitive scientists who do the research tend to focus on math, largely, sometimes science. But what I was thinking was, well, what if we look at typical literacy instruction through the lens of cognitive science? What does it tell us? And it's only really been done with regard to phonics for the most part. I mean, yes, it tells us when we're talking about phonics that kids need to practice those phonics patterns to automaticity, so they're not thinking about decoding those words. That frees up space in working memory for higher order thinking, for comprehension. But what about the way we've been trying to teach comprehension and the way we've been trying to teach writing? Cognitive scientists haven't really applied those principles of cognitive science to those things. And if you do, what you see is we've been making reading and writing much harder for kids than they need to be. With reading and writing, we've been asking them to read and write about topics that they're not that familiar with, that they may not know anything about. I mean, that's a typical approach to reading comprehension. Go choose a book at your reading level on whatever topic and practice making inferences or whatever,
Right.
There's a double problem there. You're not probably acquiring any real knowledge because it's just random topics, but also if you don't have enough background knowledge relating to the topic of a book, if it's about the solar system and you've never heard of the solar system, you're not going to be able to practice making inferences, because you can't make inferences about a topic you don't know anything about. And then with writing, it's even worse. We often ask kids to write about, we might ask them to write about personal experience, and they do know about that, but that's not using writing to deepen their knowledge of what we want them to learn, the content of the curriculum. And often, especially in recent years, we've asked them to write about topics maybe in a separate writing curriculum or prompts that teachers might find online that are about actual things in the world, but that they may not know very much about. And it's difficult to read about a topic you don't know much about, but it is impossible to write about a topic you don't know much about. And it's just an overwhelming cognitive load in both of those instances that we don't need to impose on kids if we build their knowledge of a topic initially through read-alouds and discussion through oral language, which is modulating that cognitive load if you're not yet a proficient reader, and then armed with the knowledge of a specific topic in long-term memory, we have evidence that kids will be able to read and understand a text about that topic at a higher level of complexity. And they will most likely, especially if they get good explicit writing instruction, be able to write about a topic they know about at a higher level. I mean, it stands to reason. If you've ever tried to write about a topic you don't know anything about, it's not very easy. If you're writing about a topic you know very well, it's much easier. So that's certainly one reason I wrote the book was I wanted to, first of all, make the point there's a lot of cognitive science related to reading beyond phonics, and that we really need to see, once we get past foundational reading and writing skills, we need to see reading and writing as subsets of the science of learning, because what we can comprehend when we read, what we can express when we write, draws on everything we have been able to learn, and they are also in themselves ways of learning. So we have to sort of break down these artificial walls we've erected between reading and writing, and between both of those things, and the content areas.
Yeah, yeah. And you mentioned, cognitive load, and I know in the blog piece that we started talking about, you mentioned Sweller, and he actually should be on the podcast with some other folks in hopefully in the coming weeks. But that idea of cognitive load theory and the working memory, as you're mentioning, is definitely really important. Our our I guess elementary, reading teachers, and maybe not limited to elementary, um, are you finding that they are increasingly becoming aware of cognitive load and or have been and maybe just hadn't always known that terminology, or where are you seeing, teachers who are at least intentionally, explicitly responsible for teaching of reading throughout the grade levels? How aware of cognitive load are they?
Well, I certainly talk about it, every presentation that I give, but it doesn't, in this country, I don't think they don't seem to be really learning much about it during their pre-service training. It seems to be maybe not totally unfamiliar, but I mean, teachers have told me that this really made things clearer for me, the way, explaining it in terms of cognitive load, which indicates to me that they hadn't gotten that explanation anywhere before. It's
Hmm.
very different in Australia and England, from what I can tell. Especially England, they've really infused this into a lot of teacher training, and I recently read a book talking about all of these changes, and it's hard now to find a beginning teacher who is not familiar with things like cognitive load theory. We're not there yet. And I think I will say it's great for teachers to be familiar with these principles of cognitive science. I really think it would be helpful for this to be incorporated in teacher training, curricula. But I think what really will move the needle is a combination of two things: curricula in which incorporate these principles of cognitive science, because it is very hard. I mean, I don't think I could do this as a teacher, to take principles of cognitive science and figure out on my own how to translate those things into classroom practice. And it's helpful to know about those things, but I think ideally you have a curriculum expert who is also knowledgeable about cognitive science, who has designed a curriculum that is premised on those principles, and then you as the teacher, you have the flexibility to adapt it to your particular students, but you're not starting from scratch. I think the other thing in the area of reading, and reading affects other the content areas, because it takes up so much time.
Hmm.
We place so much emphasis on reading tests. So schools are up spending 2-3 hours a day on reading, and that's time taken away from the content areas. I Ideally, I think we would have tests that don't treat reading comprehension as this isolated set of skills that can be taught and measured in the abstract, because what that leads to is, understandably, teachers focusing on teaching those. If that's what it looks like the test is testing, just a kid's abstract ability to make an inference or whatever, there's no incentive to teach any particular content or a novel or whatever. The incentive is to have kids practice making inferences, practice determining the author's purpose, all of these things.
Hmm.
And that's really counterproductive.
Yeah. Uh, is the letters program and that training, how much is that helping? I think it was Karen Vates who mentioned on social media. Hard to tell. She posts so much. It's like remembering what she's posted, what she hasn't posted. But I think she had mentioned something about letters being limited in effectiveness. I think because it was more of and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing this, but it was more of an information kind of session, and the teachers weren't working, they weren't elaborating, or something like that. What are you seeing with letters and the state of I guess the updates to teacher training in those areas?
Well, I mean, I should say I'm not, I don't have firsthand familiarity with letters, but from what I've read about it, I think it's an excellent program, but it's like kind of like a postgraduate course. And what it does, it's not a curriculum. And so I've read interviews with teachers who've been through it, who've said, well, I learned all this stuff, but then I go to my classroom and I have a curriculum that doesn't follow those principles that I learned about, or maybe contradicts them, or I'm on my own to try to figure out how to implement all that knowledge that I've acquired. I think and I'm sure Karen would agree with me on this because she's written about this, what works better is to have a curriculum and then training embedded in that curriculum. So the specifics of a curriculum. And even with phonics and decoding, different curricula are going to teach phonics patterns in a different order or whatever. I think what teachers really need is something concrete and support in implementing those lesson plans, how do we get kids to understand these particular texts, all of that. So I think that's the limitation of training in the abstract divorced from any particular curriculum.
Are we likely to get curriculum that does align with those things, and why? I mean, I think I can articulate probably at least some of the reasons why we haven't in the past. But as things shift and teachers and education and just the conversation is shifting, right? And maybe not as fast here in the States as in other places, but how likely are we to get curriculum that is aligned with those kinds of takeaways from cognitive science and phonics and letters and all of those kinds of things? And what's keeping that from happening?
Well, I think there are curricula out there that generally accord with, I mean, they may not say, we follow the science of learning and this is exactly how we're doing it, but they do provide kids with the explicit instruction they need with retrieval practice. I mean, you had John Bassett and Gary Schiffman on talking about the 4-question method, and they're working on a curriculum. The first question is in that method is what happened, and getting kids to answer that question by retelling the story of a historical event. That's retrieval practice. And that's helping to transfer that new information in long-term memory. The other 3 questions really require elaboration, and which, as I've mentioned, really incorporates retrieval practice. So I'd say, I mean, they don't advertise this necessarily as we're implementing the principles of cognitive science, but I would say they are. And there are literacy curricula that similarly do that. I think the difficulty we have is identifying them and separating the wheat from the chaff, as it were. A lot of districts and states just rely on whatever reading curriculum gets all green on ed reports. And the problem with that is ed reports started out being reliable. I mean, there are definitely some reading curricula that got all green on ed reports that are truly effective. But in recent years, they've started giving all greens to some that are not truly effective, certainly on the knowledge building side, and they've overlooked at least 1 or 2 that are effective, not giving them all greens. And we also don't have, so it's hard for the decision makers to know, is this really an effect? Is this have just a label that it's an effective curriculum, or is it really an effective curriculum? And we also don't have assessments that are good at highlighting schools that are actually doing a good job. And this is what they have been able to do, I think, to a large extent in England. They have a measure called Progress 8 that measures basically, so they have a system where there's a primary school up to about age 11, and then there's a secondary school that goes from 11 on. And so at age 16, kids take a test that measures the progress they've made since age 11. Some schools have just been knocking it out of the park on those Progress 8 assessments, some of these secondary schools, and those schools do have approaches that align with cognitive science. I visited one of them, and I was very impressed. We have test scores, but as people will tell you, of course, they largely measure demographic differences. The wealthier areas are going to have higher test scores than the lower income areas. It doesn't really tell you which schools are actually doing a good job of catching up students who may be behind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, what school was it that you visited in the UK?
It's called the Michaela Community School.
I was wondering, yeah. So, yeah, Catherine and I have, she's been on the podcast a few times. She's an interesting character. And, one of the things that I say about uh, Catherine and Michaela is I think that they are doing, I've not visited, but best I can tell, and, from what you see in their test scores and posted on social media and such, is that they're doing really great work and really important work. But it's always interesting to me that Catherine, in our exchanges, when I show her examples of what I think is some pretty good inquiry kinds of teaching, she's just horrified, which to me, I sort of find it a little bit funny because I think that highlights the differences, like that there are different outside of reading skills and numeracy skills, there are schools that have different desired academic outcomes or priorities, right? And they prioritize a certain set of things. And then there's a school of intellectual virtues in Southern California where I had and talked with them on the podcast, and their priorities are certainly overlapping, but a bit different. And to me, that is one of the things that seems to often be left out of that conversation is that there are people, there are parents, there are schools that have differing priorities in academic outcomes. I think all of the schools would say we want students to be able to read and do math, but then there's a divergence there as you get older, and I think that that's important to recognize because this is again one of the things that I think is a problem of at least in messaging of the sort of science of learning community is that there's an underlying assumption that all schools should look something like Michaela, and I don't think that most people would agree with that. And there's not a question there. It just made me think. I wondered if it was Michaela that you had visited, and she is. I had the opportunity to sit down with Catherine years ago. We ran into each other in New York City. So if you feel like commenting on it, feel free.
Yeah, well, I think, Catherine, she's very outspoken, and
Indeed, she is.
I think,
Love her to death.
I think she's great. I think I mean, I would encourage you to go visit the school because sometimes I think she emphasizes things like, the discipline.
Hmm.
Uh, and, this is when you go visit, you're not aware of the
Hmm.
disciplinary system. What you're aware of is that students are highly engaged in classrooms, and they're thinking. They actually are, depending on what is being taught. When I was there, they do a lot with writing, and I think that, as I mentioned, ensures that you're enabling kids to elaborate. It's
Hmm.
not just regurgitation.
Right,
They're
right.
learning how to express themselves and how to think. So yeah, I mean, not every school is people. There should be different choices,
Yeah,
and there are probably, I'm sure, there are ways to accomplish similar things with somewhat different methods
yeah, yeah.
from Michaela's, but their methods are working pretty well. So I think especially if you have a population of kids who are, as many of the Michaela students are, far behind where they should be in terms of knowledge and skills, um, that is one method that has been shown to work. So, maybe it wouldn't look exactly the same elsewhere, but I think there's a lot that people can learn from a school like that.
Yeah, and I wholeheartedly agree. I for essentially the same reasons that you've articulated, from what I understand, the population that they serve, it is really important. They may be coming from households where they're not getting a lot of books and a lot of knowledge and all those kinds of things, right? But I do find it really interesting because I she's not the only one that will denigrate inquiry and things, even though I will I assume that that they are doing things that we're not seeing on social media, as you mentioned, right? Things that are deeper learning. My assumption with the folks who really advocate and very strongly assert, direct instruction and explicit instruction. My assumption is that they're getting to some sort of deeper learning and questioning and using of inquiry, but they don't talk about it for whatever reasons. And maybe that's because it doesn't suit their audience, or they think it's not as important to emphasize, or I think honestly, some of the folks think that it's like a bad word, like their tribe, like you're not supposed to say these sort of taboo words.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's part of what I was talking about before, sort of, for so long, education's overlooked that foundational work of ensuring that kids have the information with which to elaborate,
Mm.
that's kind of what they want to emphasize. But the other thing that doesn't get emphasized enough about Michaela in particular is they do focus on sort of what I guess would be called character education. And
Mm.
one of the things that struck me was they at lunch when you visit, there's I don't know if this is still the case because I think that it's bigger now, but the whole school was in one room having lunch, and after they finished eating, students would get up and take turns expressing gratitude to someone. It could be a teacher, it could be a family member, and I think when visitors are there, they often express gratitude, as they did to me for coming to visit, and for, as they put it about me, for explaining the American education system to them, which I'm not sure I really did, but it's very sweet, and it also, I think, creates this very positive community where kids are kind to each other, and that is also really important.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm mindful of time. I do have at least one last question. I don't think I've shared this with you, but since the last time we spoke, my oldest daughter has matriculated to college. She's in elementary education. I couldn't talk her out of it. So she's taking education courses. I'm trying to find out what she's learning and what she's not, and she's sharing not as much as I would like, but my prying eyes will continue. Some of the things that cognitive load, though, some of those things are showing up, and again, she's only been in one semester, so it's limited sample size, but she will be doing some teaching of reading if she continues that path, whether it's elementary just in general or teaching of reading. Any advice that you would suggest I give her?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, if she's learning about cognitive load. That sounds like maybe, I don't know where she's going, but maybe she is getting more of a grounding in cognitive science than a lot of prospective teachers do. Um, I, I would say, I think it's really important where you land in terms of teaching. I mean, I don't know that any courses or even student teaching can really prepare. I've never taught K through 12, but from what I've heard, it's always going to be tough. If you've gotten better preparation, it will be less tough. But I think the other thing that's really important is to try to find a school. I mean, that meshes with how you feel education should be done. And for me, that would mean I would want a school with a knowledge building elementary curriculum, either a literacy curriculum that covers science and social studies topics, or a school schedule where they actually have time for those things in the daily schedule and actually honor that, because a lot of places it gets sort of tossed by the wayside. um, and fellow teachers and administrators who have a similar understanding of how education works. And again, for me, that would mean some grounding in the principles of cognitive science.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see, like I said, the progression and some of the things that she's learning and things she's not learning. And as she brings them home, and I say, share those assignments with me, share those with me, because I really I really want to see,
Yeah.
and hopefully have some good conversation with her, because I'm sure no matter what, there's going to be some things that I will think, boy, I wish you'd emphasized this or talked about that. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. I want to make sure that folks can find you and you can share all those things. You have your Substack and you have your book and some social media and those kinds of things. So now's the time.
Well, I think you can find all the information you might possibly want at my website, which is nataliewexler.com.
Okay. We'll put that in the show notes, but of course anybody can go there. Natalie, it's always a pleasure to talk. Yeah, I appreciate the conversation.
Same here. Thanks for having me on.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.